Hey, happy birthday to our wonderful country. 245. It's easy for me to remember that because 45 years ago to the day was the day when I was 9 years of age on July 4th, 1976, that I was baptized into Christ, and it was a Sunday. Believe it or not, 45 years ago. So it's easy for me. While America was celebrating 200 years, I was reborn at the age of 9. So happy birthday to America, and hopefully we'll have a safe and a prosperous July 4th as well. In this particular series, we're looking at God's heart as revealed through Jesus' heart through interacting with hurting people, with people that were ostracized, with people who were different, people who were hurting on behalf of someone else. And we know that God's heart touches, that God's heart marvels, that God's heart accepts, that God's heart cares. And today we deal with an interesting characteristic of his heart, a heart that confronts. Are you familiar with the character George McFly? George McFly, okay, I figured that was going to hit. So George McFly was a family man of a suburban family from the movie Back to the Future, an 80s movie, and he had all kinds of trouble. I mean, he had trouble in his home with his wife, with his kids, and he had trouble at work with the infamous bully Biff Tannen. And Biff constantly gave him trouble. Ever since high school, Biff was his nemesis. And finally, George McFly was encouraged to stand up and to take his stand against Biff. And when he was challenged to do that, George weakly responded, quote, "I just can't stand confrontation," unquote. Well, in 1980, 5 years before the movie Back to the Future came out, Christian counselor David Augsburger wrote a book that challenged the fear of confrontation. He raised this to a spiritual responsibility. In his book, Caring Enough to Confront, he actually encourages followers of Christ to recognize that relationship carries responsibility. And sometimes that responsibility is not easy, and sometimes that responsibility is not enjoyable. But if we're going to do relationships right, we need to understand that responsibility. Doing a hard thing is not necessarily doing a bad thing. Proverbs 27:6 says, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend." Some translations say, "Wounds of a friend can be trusted." Yes, confrontation, sometimes we get those wounds from a friend when they confront us with our wrongdoing or something that we have done wrong. And when we confront, because it's not easy, it's got to be done with gentleness. And it should be done with a deep sense of our own spiritual frailty, because we are all in the same sin boat. We all don't have it all together. We've all been judged before. We've judged other people. And so we have to have that deep sense of our own spiritual sin and frailty when we confront other people. But sometimes confrontation is exactly what love requires. Luke chapter 7 is where we're at today. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, so she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. In Luke chapter 7, we have polar opposites that are found in first century Israel. We've got a man versus a woman. We've got a Pharisee versus a quote-unquote sinner. We have one who is fully aware of her spiritual poverty, and another who is absolutely clueless to his spiritual need. Talk about an odd couple. That would make Felix and Oscar back in the 70s look like the same person. That's how direct polar opposites these two are. And the tension between those who were embracing Jesus' teaching and the religious leaders who mainly refused it, it sets the stage for Simon, not Peter, but Simon the Pharisee's dinner party. Now, at events like this, what would happen would be the invited guests would come and they would recline at the table and they would enjoy dinner and they would enjoy the conversation. And when traveling dignitaries and celebrities came to someone's house like that, men, not women, men would line the interior walls of the house to quietly listen to the conversation. But this is an odd scene, and this is certainly an odd couple. A woman had entered into this scene where she doesn't belong. Not only was she a woman in the wrong place, she was actually the wrong woman in the wrong place. The term sinner, who lived a sinful life, or as Simon is going to label her as a sinner, that is a very intense term. It's not mild, it's an intense word that talks about someone who is living sin as a lifestyle. Now, it's generally accepted that this particular woman was known as the community prostitute. Some have thought that, well, she's just labeled a sinner because she's a Gentile and she's not of the covenant faith of Israel. Now, I'm not going to split hairs. You can choose whatever you want to. If you want to choose that latter, understanding, you'll be wrong. But you've been wrong before because you've disagreed with me. But that's okay. We're still friends. I think it's because she was living a sinful lifestyle. But like I said, others come up with different other views about that. Listen to verse 39. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. This sinful woman rattled the masculine cage of every single man in that room, except one, except Jesus. It begins with her violation of social protocols in entering this men's only event. It reminds me of the movie Secretariat. Diane Lane starred, true story, obviously, and she walks into this men's only club, and you could just see the looks of the guys. You could even see the look from the woman who was serving, like she was totally out of place, but nothing was going to deter her. And that's what this woman was like. A woman entering that room, unless she was serving, was her presence was shocking. But her presence had very little to do with who she was and everything to do with who Jesus was, because that's why she came. She anoints Jesus with a highly valuable perfume. She wept so profusely, her tears wet the master's feet. And in a massive social error, she lets down her hair, and the Bible refers to women's hair as her glory, and that was something that was only done by Jewish women in the privacy of their own home in front of their husband. She lets down her hair and begins to dry Jesus' feet with her hair. So Simon starts his private thoughts. He's musing about this. He's thinking about it. And his thoughts range in two vastly different directions, but they're connected. Not only does this woman prove who she is by her behavior that is very shocking and considered sinful, but she may at the same time simultaneously be proving who Jesus isn't, because Jesus had been regarded and proclaimed as a prophet. But a real prophet would know better. A real prophet would condemn this woman's actions. A real prophet would have held the line of religious rituals in this particular environment, and Jesus wasn't doing that. To Simon the Pharisee and the men around that table and around that room, everything was wrong about this situation. To the watching members of the community, they think that it's wrong. Everyone thinks it's wrong except two people that are there. One of them is the woman who is giving the service, this act of worship to Jesus, and the other is Jesus. And that may be what is most shocking to Simon. Listen to these verses. Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Tell me, teacher, he said. Two people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay them back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. You have judged correctly, Jesus said. The Bible is full of stories, and the Bible is full of storytellers. In Jewish culture, stories were more than just a way to communicate, more than just a way to teach, more than just a way to entertain. The stories were actually a part of Jewish culture. It was a part of their fabric. And maybe that's perhaps the reason why storytelling made for such a subtle and profound form when you had to confront someone. Now, the classic example of this in the Old Testament has to do with David and Nathan. And David had a one-night stand with Bathsheba. She became pregnant. He was trying to hide it. He was hiding out for 9 months. And in the course of that 9 months, he had Uriah, one of his mighty men, who was Bathsheba's husband, killed on the front lines of battle. He had the commander move Uriah to the front, and the rest of the troops withdrew so that Uriah would certainly be killed. And so Nathan, the prophet, who is, going to deal with this awkward situation, but he cares enough to confront David. And so he chooses a story to tell David. And it's about a family, and it's about a lamb, and it's about a scoundrel for a neighbor who takes away the lamb. And the lamb is the only possession this family has. Well, David just goes into this nuclear rage, and Nathan spins it and shows David to be the scoundrel because he was responsible for Uriah's death, and Bathsheba was referenced as that lamb to Uriah. And through the story, David's disarmed. He's exposed. And Jesus used this same approach with Simon's attitudes and his thoughts. And much like our world, the first century world was made up of debts. There were debtors and there were creditors, and everyone at that table would be able to find themselves within this story, either as a debtor or a creditor, or maybe both. But the wrinkle of this particular story has to do with the forgiveness that came with the debt, and that's what would have been shocking. 50 denarii, or a denarius, was equal to 1 day's wage. So 50 days or almost 2 months. Think about that for yourself, what 2 months of income would be like, and to have that debt forgiven. That's quite a large sum. But 500 days, that's almost a year and a half, and that's even a larger sum. But the key element of this story doesn't have to do with the amounts that are owed or the disparity between the debt. In fact, when Jesus applied the story, the only reason for the disparity of the debt is the power of the response of love and gratitude from the one who was forgiven. The application of the story is that they are both debtors. Both of them were accountable. Both of them had a need. The woman, the sinful woman, recognizes and sees her need, but Simon is oblivious to his own need. It's easy for Simon to say, she's a sinner, but almost impossible for him to say, I too am a sinner. But Jesus proves he is truly worthy of the term prophet because he read Simon's thoughts and he deals with his need. See, the parable doesn't deal with the amount of sin as much as it deals with the awareness of your sin. Her sins, the woman's sins, were well known, but Simon had his hidden from everyone except God. Both of them were bankrupt and couldn't pay their debt to God. Simon was just as spiritually bankrupt as the woman, but he didn't even realize it. And so Jesus' purpose in telling the story was to open Simon's eyes to his deep spiritual need. At Simon's feast, the woman and the man, they were on equal ground as debtors. But they displayed very different responses to that debt. In trying to penetrate Simon's religious armor, so to speak, Jesus asked him to make the application. And the application was this: a heart of love, a heart of gratitude is the normal response to forgiveness. And if you're aware of the depths of your need, then you will be overwhelmed by that love that forgives. And let's personalize this for a minute. Maybe in your marriage, at some particular point, you really messed up. You messed up bad. You messed up more than once. You messed up multiple times, maybe with multiple people, maybe in multiple places, at multiple environments. If your spouse chose to forgive you, you see how this is starting to get personal. If your spouse chose to forgive those errors of judgment, and not just those errors of judgment, but that sin, you should be overwhelmed by their love. You should be moved by their compassion. You should be wanting to retaliate with love and with kindness and with generosity and with devotion and grace and mercy, because you were loved so much that you were forgiven from so much. Love is the only appropriate response to such love and forgiveness. Listen to these next verses. Then he turned towards the woman and said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little." Now think about this for a minute. Turning toward the woman, Jesus speaks to Simon. Think about the physicality of this particular moment. Jesus is speaking to Simon, but he's looking at the woman. This woman is clearly in the spotlight of Jesus. Jesus sees her thoroughly. The question is, does Simon? Simon thinks he sees her. In fact, Simon thinks he sees her better than Jesus does. But Jesus is trying to awaken Simon's slumbering heart from religious self-satisfaction to grace and mercy and love. The woman's actions spring from the reality of forgiveness that Jesus had already granted. Forgiveness was the point of the debtor story. That love generated from being forgiven was huge. And Luke chooses not to tell us when this happened. Maybe it was a few days earlier that this woman met Jesus and she placed her faith in Jesus and her sins were washed away. Maybe it's in this particular moment right now that she has found this grace, but whenever it happened and it just consumed her to want to just throw all caution to the wind, all social norms, and just worship at his feet. That was the moment. The sinful woman is in the spotlight, but that spotlight is slowly moving to the man sitting next to Jesus. Normal hospitality in that day would have meant that Simon, who had this special guest of Jesus, invited him to his house, he would have dispatched servants to wash his feet. It would have been normal that Jesus would have received an anointing of oil to refresh himself from the day's events. It would have been normal for Simon to greet his guest with a ceremonial kiss, and none of that happened. It seems like this woman rushed in to give to Jesus what the host had withheld. Common hospitality should have motivated Simon to provide these courtesies, but something even deeper motivated the woman. Love. Receiving mercy. Jesus' grace. Grateful love had driven her to do what the moment demanded, and she stepped in to fill the void that Simon's oversight had left. Listen to these next two verses. Then Jesus said to her, "Your sins are forgiven." The other guests began to say among themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" Jesus said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." I wonder how Jesus felt when he left Simon's house that day. Was he troubled by the Pharisees' lack of self-awareness? Now, we can easily forget that Simon was just as much of part of Jesus' rescue mission as the woman, as the man born blind, as the Roman centurion, as the leper, as the woman with the hemorrhage, as Jairus' family. Jesus came to seek and to save the lost, and that included this Pharisee who was spiritually blind to his own lostness. As seen in many of the case of Simon the Pharisee, Jesus was doing everything that he could to reveal the prescription, not just the need, but the prescription, the remedy that this religious leader needed. Now, some religious leaders like Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea, they responded to Jesus' message, but in every case, Jesus showed that he cared, and he cared enough to confront. The woman got it. The question is, did Simon? And more importantly, the question is, have you? So what's our faith step? I want to encourage you to deal with it. I want to encourage you to deal with it. There's things that we've all put off dealing with. Maybe this week is not the exact week that you need to make the phone call or write the letter. Maybe it is. Maybe this week is the week where you say, you know what? I need to start beginning to pray about confronting this situation. I've avoided things in my own life for decades, and it's just been recently I've started to deal with it. We all have those things. But sometimes to make the most out of our relationships and to have an honest and to have a genuine relationship with someone, you got to deal with some of the uncomfortable stuff. Now, I'm not encouraging you to be a bull in a china shop. That's not what I'm encouraging you to do. I'm encouraging you, when you confront someone, to do it gently. And I'm encouraging you to remember your own spiritual frailty, your own spiritual need. Confront someone the way you would want to be confronted. Pick the right time. Pick the right time. Pick the right moment. Be prayed up before you go. God, I want to obey you. I want to try to reconcile this relationship. I want to confront this situation. Give me the spirit that I need. Give me the attitudes that I need. Give me a spirit of peace. Help this person to have a receptive heart when I go and I talk to them. Let me fulfill my duty, my responsibility of the ministry of reconciliation. That is a powerful prayer to pray. It's a very serious prayer to pray. But if we're going to do relationships right, this aspect of Jesus' heart is certainly one that needs to be implemented in our lives. Let's pray.